In this session, we'll add some political ecology insights to the overarching theme of this course on a human rights-based approach to environmental change and displacement. We can begin by recognizing the growing recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and safe environment. For example, in April 2011, the UN Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 1611 on human rights and the environment. It recognized that sustainable development and the protection of the environment can contribute to human well-being and the enjoyment of human rights. Conversely, it also recognized that environmental damage can have negative implications, both direct and indirect, for the effective enjoyment of human rights. Shortly following this resolution, in March 2012, Professor John Knox was announced as the first independent expert on human rights and the environment. During his tenure in this position, Professor Knox produced a number of important studies, first mapping out the extent to which the right to a clean, healthy, and safe environment is recognized in various constitutions and national law, regional agreements, as well as the international conventions on human rights. He also produced thematic studies on climate change and human rights, as well as on biodiversity and human rights, and children's rights and the environment. In March 2015, the position of independent expert was elevated to become a special rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And in 2018, Professor Knox was succeeded by David Boyd as the new special rapporteur. Importantly, on the 8th of October 2021, the UN Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 4813 that recognized that having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is indeed a human right. More specifically, there's also a growing recognition of the connection between human rights and climate change. There have been a growing number of statements from the UN Human Rights Council that recognize that climate change has implications for the full enjoyment of human rights. These include resolutions in 2006, 2009, and 2011, as well as more recently. The Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights and the Environment have also produced two reports, first in 2016 and again in 2019. In these reports, the obligations of states through a human rights perspective have been emphasized. Both studies also map out examples of best practices and practical actions that could be taken to protect and promote human rights in relation to climate change. Further elevating the importance of this connection between human rights and climate change, on the 8th of October 2021, the Human Rights Council announced Resolution 4814 that announced the creation of a special rapporteur on the human rights impacts of climate change. Within the Paris Agreement between the governments of the world, it is also stated that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the right of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. In sum total, we can see that there's a growing momentum to really tackle the issue of climate change through a human rights-based approach. There is also a growing recognition of the connection between climate change, migration or forced displacement, and human rights, which is the theme of this overall course. This reflects the fact that environmental migrants as a group have been recognized, and this includes environmental migrants who moved due to climate change created impacts. People movement may be across borders, Or it may be as internal displacement, with internally displaced people counting as the larger number who have been displaced by climate change to date. This relationship has been subject to a range of studies by academics, by UN agencies, as well as by civil society and think tanks, who continue to deepen the understanding of what does it mean to apply a human rights-based approach to ensure the protection of environmental migrants who are forced or choose to move due to climate change. Meanwhile, in terms of state-to-state cooperation, this has occurred through the UN system, including through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and more specifically through the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and preceding it, the Nansen Initiative. However, there is still much work to do to really develop a comprehensive human rights-based approach towards environmental change or climate change and forced displacement. There are existing frameworks to be built from, such as the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, and these have been recently reinterpreted in the context of disaster-related displacement, including by colleagues at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Also, there are frameworks that could be drawn upon, such as the disaster and risk reduction frameworks, including the Sendai framework. We can now turn to the question of what value does a political ecology lens add to understanding a human rights-based approach to environmental change, climate change, and migration or forced displacement. As we've discussed in previous sessions, a general perspective of political ecology is to understand the political or the politicized relationship between people and the environment. This could be expressed, for example, in terms of who can access, who can use, or who controls resources, as well as how this connects to people's livelihoods and well-being. That relationship alone is often understood in terms of substantive human rights, such as the right to life, the right to health, the right to water, and so on. But political ecology also helps us look at deeper levels or deeper dynamics to understand how vulnerability is produced through offering a broader economic, social, and political perspectives on the processes involved. And these may be both in the present, but also have historical origins. Therefore, a political ecology perspective can help us understand why human rights may be at risk or are being violated, including in relation to climate change. A particularly important dimension of this analysis would relate to understanding the social or the power relations that are involved. And this can in turn help us understand why the state does or does not fulfill its duty to protect human rights related to climate change, as well as why individuals can or cannot claim their human rights, even if they're legally defined, for example, in the Constitution. Many of these types of rights relate to procedural rights, for example, the right to access information, the right to participation, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to freedom of assembly. Another long-standing concern of political ecology has related to the politics of knowledge. In other words, whose knowledge counts and whose does not count when we analyze or try and understand a particular issue, such as climate change and forced displacement. So in analyzing this politics of knowledge, political ecologists will look at the discourses or the narratives that seek to explain a phenomenon in a particular way. And this in turn can help us understand why laws and policies are created to include particular categories and not others. So it's increasingly recognized, for example, that when we look at disaster-related laws, environmentally forced displacement in the short term, or environmentally emergency migrants in the language of IOM, is or may be recognized because movement relates to an immediate emergency event. However, there's far less recognition that's being given to people who have to move due to slow onset environmental change, even though in many ways they are also environmentally forced migrants. Another long-standing concern of political ecology has been the impacts of environmental injustice on marginalized groups. So these could include, for example, how impacts are often gendered, or the impacts that may be on children or ethnic minorities or those in extreme poverty. And this reflects the human rights of members of groups in vulnerable situations. So political ecology can help us understand how those vulnerable situations are generated and why certain groups may experience those vulnerable situations in particular ways. We discussed this, for example, in the political ecology of flooding and migration. Finally, and very much connected to environmental injustice, political ecology has also drawn attention to the issue of climate injustice. And in that sense, it's helped both identify and narrate some of the inequalities in terms of the distributions of harms that are being created by climate change at scales that range from the global to the local.